this idea of, in a way, perhaps the institution as a kind of a fence, but perhaps art itself as a fence in itself, the category of art. And my question will be somehow, how do we get outside the fence? How do we get outside that hoarding either of the institution or the category of art? How do we make art politically effective? And I think it really sort of is also inspired by you, Stephen, and your thoughts about how do we move from art practice into or utopian thinking into action.
Should we start?
Yeah.
And this is actually great because this is one of the things I was thinking with Malcolm. Malcolm and I were talking about Gramsci earlier, and the storming of the Winter Palace is the classic war of maneuver, which is you have a political party, you have an army, you storm the state, you grab state power, and bingo, revolution happens. Gramsci's great innovation was to say, well, that's not good enough. You also need a war of position. And the war of position is the staking out of the eco-communities. It's creating sort of these lived revolutionary moments within the society we have now, which art is one of those things. Art is a place in which one can imagine a different order, whether it's formal or content, than the world we live in now. Great. But I think that the problem is that Gramsci always said you also need the war of maneuver at the same time, is that it's not good enough to just create these sort of pockets of resistance, these pockets of a different way of seeing the world. You also, after a certain point, have to organize political parties and seize state power. And so I think this isn't an answer, this is a further problematization of, I think we're actually doing okay on the war of position. I think we're doing pretty dreadful on the war of maneuver.
Well, I've got one if you need. Ready. Do you want me to?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful and really interesting. I'd agree with you, Stephen. And there is so much that goes on out there in very small ways, but it's growing. Because it's very hard to imagine what doesn't exist, it might actually be crucial sometimes to demonstrate a possibility. To say, no, practically you could actually do this. Perhaps on a quite small scale, and then there are issues around how you translate that onto a big society-wide scale, and that's very difficult. But that could be worked with. As to the other, I don't know, in the US, it was interesting that earlier today, he's not here, they've come for him. The man said Denmark isn't a free country. There's a man in a green shirt. I don't see him.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, shit.
He's gone.
I hope he's all right.
Hopefully not to prison.
They're listening. Do you have listening rooms in the art galleries here? I don't know, anyway. But in the United Kingdom, environmentalists are now treated as terrorists. In terms of how the law operates, certain official categorizations, environmental protesters can be dealt with as if they were terrorists. This is a conscious step that's been taken. Plus new policing tactics, it's much, much more difficult to maneuver. It doesn't stop it happening altogether, because with ingenuity you can be somewhere else one step ahead and so on. But the police are getting into all the Twitter stuff and so on. It's very hard, you know. And we're certainly no longer in the days of Seattle when you could have this international mass movement suddenly happening and taking people by surprise. No, that gets stopped. That gets really heavily stamped on now. And I think for many people it's really hard to know what to do. Reclaim the Streets in London pretty much ceased operating because they were too worn out. And it's quite a despairing situation.
Any other comments?
No, maybe this is kind of narrow and nerdy, but does this work?
Yeah.
Sorry. But sort of from an aesthetic point of view, I'm worried about the eradication of difference that utopian discourse rakes on art. As you say, in the utopian society, that there's no need for art, and that's probably true. Or we can see how the aesthetics have been instrumentalized and has come back in the 90s and today as, you know, as control or as money, etc. But I'm kind of skeptical to art activist positions and the hybridization that's at stake in art activism, because it seems to take place to the detriment of art and to the detriment of difference. And I think that this is not just, I'm not just saying this to pit sort of Marcuse against later postmodern positions, but I think an interesting example or counterexample to quote against such notions of hybridization that Marcuse perhaps nurtured or was in the air in the 60s at least, would be Ad Reinhardt, the American artist, who famously said that art is art, everything else is everything else. And he wrote these very sort of, you know, hard-nosed manifestos where it proceeded via negation. So, you know, art is this, art is that, and it's definitely not that, etc., etc. So, you know, on the face of it, a very sort of orthodox modernist position, perhaps. But at the same time, there was a, you know, he was maneuvering, he was operating a multiplicity of his artistic persona, namely that he was also, he was an activist, he was a labor organizer, he was a cartoonist, so he drew satirical cartoons for communist newspapers in the States. So, and I think that this is perhaps ties back to what you were saying, Malcolm, about the tensions. And I mean, because to Reinhardt, this sort of multi-track activities that are impossible to gel, they're impossible to hybridize, but some really interesting tensions were created between them, between him being a, you know, abstract painter, who painted non-figuratively, who painted black monochromes for the last 13 years of his life, his activism, his satirical cartoons.
Yeah, shall I, or do you want? I mean, I think it would be too easy just to say, gosh, what repetition in all those black monochromes. Though I do sort of wonder, but however, they had a particular meaning at that time. You could also look at it in more view through Adorno's aesthetic theory, say, as to, well, art on the edge of awfulness can hardly speak. It's a kind of a speaking of silence almost. But that isn't really quite what he says. It's more, and I should also mention that Marcuse gives very little example from, if any, from visual art. His background is more in literature. His PhD thesis was on the German artist novel, which is a late 19th century genre connected to the educational novel, the novel of the life journey. And I think he stays pretty much with literature as what really informs him. However, the example that Adorno gives repeatedly in aesthetic theory is Samuel Beckett. So Waiting for Godot, Endgame, some of his prose writing, does seem to me a kind of utterance right on the edge. It's almost to say nothing. But, as Adorno would put it, the absurdity of the administered world is sedimented in it. And it still makes a good play. And that's important. So, I suppose, again, if you, just very briefly, if you read either Adorno or Marcuse in the aesthetic dimension gives a kind of compressed version of part of what Adorno says, and slightly it's different as well, but it almost seems at times that art's aesthetic dimension and its social dimension cancel each other. If art is social, it ceases to be aesthetic. If art is aesthetic, it ceases to be socially engaged, because it must be critically distanced and it must be autonomous. But I don't think that's what he means. What I think they both mean is there's that tension between them, which is potentially creative. That's where the work of theory takes place. And that's where, I suppose, I think of myself operating in a sense. And what we're never going to come up with is an answer to that, one or the other, or a resolution. The important thing is to keep the question open almost at any cost, which is why maybe Adorno writes so long, but Marcuse writes short. And also, we're not going to live in utopia, by the way. I mean, it's not like we're getting there. You know, it's never, certainly not in my lifetime anyway. It may get slightly better, that's it. Yes, fine, I'll shut up now.
Oh, so yeah, we have Richard first.
Well, no, I just wanted to say that you I've asked a very difficult question, as evidenced by the fact that nobody's answered it. I mean, not even close to answering. I mean, I think at some level, artists are political, and they can have an impact on the political world. I mean, it depends on your understanding of what that impact entails. I mean, there isn't a revolutionary project that artists can link their activities to, and there isn't a new world just waiting at the corner to be created. So in some sense, we have to understand the political potentiality of art as existing within, what Gramsci characterizes as a kind of trench installation warfare. You know, it's not like there's going to be some major transformation. And part of the problem with the way people understand the politicization of art is they have this sort of historical avant-gardist view of what art can achieve. And that's somehow the only framework within which you can think about the political potential of art. And it simply doesn't exist anymore. It's historically anachronistic to think of art in that way. But it doesn't mean that Norman's work on playgrounds doesn't have political implications and that it won't affect the way people think about things. It's a very complex question, and it probably should be looked at mainly in terms of the very small-scale immediate effect that artists might have. And I think utopian strategies, which need to be delineated. They can't just be, not every political artist is a utopian. I mean, it has to have some specificity to it, otherwise it's useless as an analytic concept. And in a way, when you sit through a couple of days of discussion of it and you hear people talking about it from different perspectives, for me, what I come away with is a desire to narrow it, not to broaden it out, not to open it up to some sort of endless discussion, because it gets too frustrating, it just becomes too slippery. And so I think what I said earlier yesterday was that utopian strategies can be politically effective. I think their effect lies primarily in their diagnostic capability. I think that it can help people to understand the circumstances under which they exist, at least some aspect of the circumstances under which they exist better. But I don't think it can be linked to the establishment of a utopia. And at a certain level, I do think discussions about whether art would exist in utopia are irrelevant. It's broadly based on Marcuse's fusion of a sort of Marxist notion of non-alienated labor with Freudian ideas of what motivates the personality and so on. But it seems irrelevant because the utopia is not about something that we're going to achieve. It's a kind of model that we use to think about the conditions under which we exist. So my answer is like an unsatisfactory one, but I think at least there's some specificity to it. Art has to find its own subject matter in the world, and sometimes that subject matter will be political, and sometimes, if circumstances are right, and the decisions that the artists make are right, they may have some effect, but it can't go much beyond that, it seems to me. So, I don't know if
I would also like to go back to your question. You asked, if I remember correctly, how do we get art out of the fence? And I would say that if we should take this dialectic dimension of utopia seriously, which Stephen mentioned, and which I also attempted to reflect upon myself, then if art really gets out of the fence, then this dialectics has disappeared, because the utopian dialectics is about place that is out of the fence and non-place, that is art's virtual dimension inside the fence. So I would say, if we should take this dimension, the utopian dimension, seriously in art, art's utopian potential should sometimes be let loose, so to speak, in place outside, but it should continuously re-scan all the possibilities of alternative ways of being in the non-place. So it's a continuous dialectical figure working, and which I don't think it will really be emptied out, because exactly we will not, and we will never end up in the perfect place. The work will never be done So we are continuously in need of this dialectical figure.
Okay, thank you very much. This is it, folks. We reached, and obviously we haven't reached any solution. No, but we have to. I think we should keep to the schedule, because people might have planned something for Friday night. Who knows? I will, at least on behalf of ARKEN, thank you very much for attending, both you in the auditorium and of course you speakers. Thank you for coming, and thank you for participating so lively in our debate, and thank you for sharing your points of view. No solution, no conclusion, I guess, but of course I hope a lot of ideas that will eventually seep out into different discourses when you speak and write and evaluate the notion of utopia with your friends over a glass of wine tonight and in the future, hopefully. That's the essence, I guess. Hope, that's what we have to keep on to. I hope the storm won't throw you away into the sea.
I went to Denmark and I was thrown away by the storm.
And I think that's
So
the words from
wrong in
here.
the state of Denmark.
Thank you for coming, and thank you for coming.
Gosh, how dramatic the storm.
Det er fordi, der er blevet smadret deres ruder.